Hello, and welcome to Field Lab Earth, the podcast that's all about past and present advances in the fields of agronomic, crop, soil, and environmental sciences. Today, we'll be talking to Theresa Brehm. Installing pipelines can cause a lot of disruption to farms, their soils, and their yields in the years immediately following installation. Contracts provide reimbursement for damage as farmlands recuperate, but additional research is crucial to ensure that farms are fully restored when this reimbursement ends. In this episode, Theresa joins me to discuss her research regarding farmland restoration after pipeline installation. I'm your host, Abby Morrison. Let's talk about science. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the show. Today we have Theresa Brehm with us. Theresa grew up on a dairy farm in northeastern Iowa. She did her undergraduate studies at Iowa State University in Ames, Iowa, where she studied environmental science with a focus in soil science and global resource systems. Her focus was on soil fertility, and she did internships, service learning, and study abroad experiences in Peru, Uganda, and India. During her time at Iowa State, she served as a lab technician in the Plant and Soil Interactions Lab, headed by Marshall McDaniel. Following her undergraduate degrees, she attended Ohio State University. She is currently a resource conservationist with the USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service, where she focuses on soil health, though she'll be speaking today from the capacity as the primary author of this research, not as a USDA employee. Hello, Theresa. How are you doing today?
Good. How are you doing?
I am doing so well. So excited to talk today. So we are talking about soil remediation and how long that can take when pipelines are installed. So just to get us started, can you tell us a little bit more just about what this overall experience is like for farmers who have these installed, what that looks like, how remediation is typically addressed, both like physically and between different parties, things like that, timelines, all of that good stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. So just a little bit of background. All of the research that we did for this study was based in Ohio, but there are pipelines, oil and natural gas pipelines being installed all across the country, all across the world. And it's obviously super important because as a global society, we have a lot of energy requirements. So this is a really efficient way of bringing energy to people, but there's also some ramifications afterwards. So normally when these pipelines are installed, they go through agricultural lands. So it has an impact across crop production, but also soil quality and fertility over time as well. So normally when these pipelines are installed, they go through a right-of-way area or an easement as it's typically known. And this can be anywhere from 100 feet to 200 feet to 500 feet wide. And this is normally where the pipeline trench is actually laid, as well as the work area where all the heavy equipment is trafficking over this entire area. So sometimes when farmers are engaging in these contracts to get the pipelines installed on their lands, they go through a process with the pipeline company themselves to kind of create this contract about when remediation is going to be complete and what they can expect that to look like. Normally, when the pipeline companies are making those contracts, the contract will say that there will be 100% compensation during the first year for any crop loss, and then that decreases by about 25% for the next few years sequentially. So by year 4 or 5, there's no compensation for any damages to the land. But there's obviously a lot of interactions happening on that land. There's a lot of heavy equipment. There can be some compaction. And so we started this study because there were a few pipelines that were being installed in northern Ohio, and we wanted to see if these claims by the pipeline companies that land would be 100% back to production within 5 years with no adverse effects would actually be accurate or not. So we wanted to just validate that claim and then be able to share that information with farmers because we found that there wasn't really a lot of research that had been conducted on this type of landscape, so within pipelines and agricultural interactions.
It occurs to me that we should also just real quick define remediation for anyone who's not familiar with that term, which is basically just restoring the land to what it was like before any action was taken on it. So that's kind of what we're discussing is how long these things take and all that good stuff. So specifically, you had a few different areas in which you were trying to see if things had been fully restored or not in these timelines. So can you go over some of the research questions you were hoping to address with this research?
Sure. Yeah, so we started off by looking at it specifically from an agricultural perspective. So we had spoken with some farmers, and they had said that, well, we're seeing some ponding in some of our fields, or we're seeing decreased crop yields. So we wanted to look at it from kind of like a 1,000-foot overview and just looking at that broad scale aspect, but then also narrowing it down into some of the more specific soil concerns. So one of our primary questions was that we wanted to understand how crop yields might be different between right-of-way areas and non-right-of-way areas. We also wanted to look at how pipeline installation has changed remediation over time. So from a personal perspective, I grew up on a dairy farm in the Midwest, and we had a field where there was a pipeline installed back when my grandparents owned the farm. So way back in like the 1930s and 40s, there was a pipeline that was installed. And obviously, technology has changed a lot, and best use practices have changed a lot in the last 90 to 100 years, which is really exciting. But in my perspective, on our farm, we had a lot of damages that I could still see while growing up on the area. Crop yields were still decreased after all that time. And I knew that that pipeline had been installed with what was called a single lift. So that's normally when essentially a backhoe just goes in and scrapes the entire segment of the pipeline trench out. And then after that, the pipeline's installed and that soil is completely put back, just kind of dumped back into that trench. More recently, pipelines are installed with a double lift or a triple lift excavation. So that's where the topsoil and subsoil are measured out, and then the first layer is taken out and the topsoil is piled in a separate area compared to the subsoil. And a triple lift is obviously getting more nitty-gritty into the actual horizons of the soil. So the pipelines that were installed were all double lift excavations. So I really wanted to look at how pipeline installation has changed over time. So some of the older studies that we were able to find, they were from like the 1980s, and those were mostly single lift excavation compared to more current practices. So we wanted to kind of update the science there and explain what the remediation actually looks like over time with these improved technologies.
Yeah, so you were looking at the crop yields and kind of soil properties as soil get disturbed as part of this process and the historical side. There was also a social component that you were looking into. Can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously, anytime that anything is done on land, farmers are going to have a really emotional response to it. I can personally attest to that. There's a really intense connection to the land and wanting to be a good steward of that land. So when pipeline installation occurs, farmers are told there's going to be a certain remediation timeline. They want that to be able to follow through. So we wanted to just document the experience of farmers who had pipelines go through their fields and see what the process looked like from the beginning through the end to right now, essentially. So we conducted a survey with the help of a social scientist at Ohio State, and it had 3 different components, basically looking at what the conditions were, what the land use history was before the pipeline was installed, and then during the pipeline installation process, what yields looked like before and after, and just self-reported yields, essentially. And then the last component was a landowner experience section. So we were really asking questions about, how did you feel? Did you have an experience during this time? Did you feel like you had a choice in interacting with this? Do you feel like your land's back to the production that it was beforehand? And just kind of looking at a little bit more of those emotional responses to pipeline installation as well.
Yeah, I love that. Farmers do a lot. They're under a lot of pressure. So I'm glad you're checking in on them. I'm going to ask a bonus question, and feel free to just not answer if you don't want to. It's kind of personal. But do you feel that your experiences growing up on a farm that had a pipeline installation on it, like, led you in part to this research or guided your interests? I'm just curious.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. No, surprisingly, because I didn't know that the pipeline was installed until I started this research, funny enough. So I had started this research and I was talking with my parents, and my dad essentially went, "Oh yeah, you know, that little patch in that field that we've always had bad yield." And I'm like, "Oh yeah, it's just a bad section of the soil." I hadn't really thought through it. And from that point on, I talked to my dad and then my aunts and uncles about the history of it. And I learned that there was a pipeline that had been installed in there afterwards. So it was kind of a funny back and forth between that.
Wow, that's amazing. I'm so glad that I asked that. Moving forward, though, you tested a whole bunch of things as part of this. You were sampling and measuring quite a lot. So can you tell us more about the methods? So introducing a little bit more about the sites, but then also just how you were conducting your research.
Sure. So we had evaluated 29 different field sites across Northern Ohio across 3 different pipelines. So we had the Rover, Utopia, and Nexus pipelines. So some of these pipelines were federally regulated and subject to eminent domain. And there was another pipeline that was not subject to eminent domain. This was a privately funded project. And we collected soils data and crop yields across the right-of-way area as well as an adjacent unaffected area. And the challenging part about this study was that we weren't able to do a true before and after. So I had started my master's program after the pipelines were installed, and we hadn't been able to collect data before the pipelines were installed. So we chose to do the adjacent unaffected area as kind of that pseudo replicate. So a before completely unaffected area, it was outside of the right-of-way. And we were able to use that as a comparison, just saying, this is what the ideal conditions for the field would be in this weather year, right? So we had a year that we had a really intense drought, and then the next year was one of the wettest that we had on record for that area. So we were able to do that cross comparison. For all of our pipelines, we took 3 equidistant sampling points along the pipeline, as well as 3 paired sampling points in that adjacent unaffected area. And at each of those sampling points, we took soil cores, and we also hand harvested yields. In addition to that, we took penetration resistant samples using a cone penetrometer. And we did that in a higher replicate because it's known to be a little bit less accurate over time. So we were able to take more samples to be able to kind of create that average across that sampling point. And then when we got back to the lab, we measured soil moisture and determined coarse rock fragments. So it's basically, we put some of the soil through a sieve and measured how many rocks were in there just to see if there was any rock fragments coming up from that pipeline excavation that were lower in the soil horizon. And then we did an aggregate stability measurement, which is really looking at how well the soil holds itself together. And then we also measured particle size distribution, which is a really fancy way of saying we measured how the soil texture changed in the right-of-way versus adjacent areas. And then we did a whole bunch of chemical suite like pH, soil organic matter, cation exchange capacity, and all that good stuff as well.
Nice. What is eminent domain? What does that mean?
Oh, good question. So eminent domain is essentially when the federal government comes through and says, we're going to do this thing and it's for the common good. So we're going to compensate you for the land, but you don't really have a choice whether it's going to be installed or not. And so farmers that are subject to eminent domain have a little bit less wiggle room when being able to decide if they want the pipeline to be there. They just get to decide this is how we're going to proceed. And they have a little bit less autonomy when it comes to that situation.
Okay. Cool. I just wanted to understand a new term that I am learning today. Can you tell me more about how the survey was done? Was that just for every farmer that was involved? Anyone around? How did that work?
Yeah, absolutely. So that was really the largest learning curve for me. So I came from like a physical sciences background. I was really interested in being able to talk about soil science and really get into the nitty-gritty there. But as we were going through this study, we realized like, hey, we're looking at 3 entire pipelines that cross an entire state. And there's obviously a lot more landowners that are affected by this than the field groundwork that we're able to actually do. So in our field work, we were really limited by time. This was completed during COVID. So we were subject to all of those extra regulations. Like we weren't able to be in the lab at the same time as some of our other lab workers and all of that stuff as well. So we were looking at this field survey as an opportunity to get on the ground work done. But then the farmer survey that we actually sent out, we were thinking that this could be a way for us to get data across the entire pipeline rather than just the on-the-ground samples. So we sent it out to 600 landowners across all 3 pipelines. So that's 200 surveys per pipeline. And essentially, I did a lot of groundwork and plotted out where the pipeline ran through the state and dropped GPS points and went through county tax auditors' websites and everything like that, was able to find landowners, and we sent all of the surveys out that way.
Wow, that's incredible. That's so much extra work. You're really putting it in for this project. That's awesome.
Yeah, it seemed like a really important aspect of the project just to be able to really capture what the farmers were experiencing, because there's obviously going to be a little bit of bias in the farmers that wanted to work with us and were really excited to reach out. There's normally an aspect of like, I'm really excited and happy about this, or really excited to talk about this because I had a negative experience. So we wanted to get the survey out there to kind of capture the in-between as well as the extremes.
Yeah, for sure. Always want a lot of data with anything survey related. So what did you find then? What were your results?
That is a great question. We had a lot of data that we analyzed, so I'm going to try not to get too in the weeds. So let me know if I'm getting too far into it. Overall, we saw that there was decreased crop yields in both corn and soybeans in the right-of-way areas across all of the pipelines. So corn yields were decreased by 23.8% in our first year of study and 19.5% in our second year of study. So an average of about 21% over both years. And then soybean yields were lower by about 7.4% and 12.5% in the first and second years, respectively. So a decrease in all of the yields, but a more significant decrease in our corn yields. And just visually, I was able to see that the corn cobs were smaller and a little bit more misshapen in our right-of-way areas compared to our adjacent areas, which I just thought was interesting personally. When we were looking at the soils, our penetration resistance was significantly higher. So it was about a little over 15% higher in our right-of-ways compared to our adjacent areas. And this just meant that we saw a significant increase in compaction. So there was definitely an impact, even 5 years after the fact, of that heavy machinery going across that land over and over again. We also saw that our particle size distribution, so that's that texture again, was lower in our right-of-way areas. So this means that basic soil science. So soil texture is sand, silt, and clay particles, and the sand is obviously the largest texture, and the clay is the smallest texture. So when we're seeing a decrease in our particle size distribution, that just means that in our top areas where we were sampling the soil, there's more clay there. And so in this section, it's really important because normally the clay in the areas that we were sampling is higher in our subsoils. So essentially, we read this to mean that there's more soil mixing between that topsoil and subsoil, which is evident after, the soils are kind of churned as they're excavated and then put back onto the trench after the pipeline's installed. So with that soil distribution, we saw about 12 grams per kilogram of clay higher in our right-of-way areas compared to the top 20 centimeters of our adjacent areas, which is really, really important for this study. It was consistent with what we predicted, but again, just surprising that it was that significant. We expected to see a lot more variability across all of our sites. And obviously, anytime that a pipeline's installed, the conditions are going to be different for every farm. So Tuesday at Farmer Joe might be very different than Wednesday at Farmer Tina's farm. And it could just be that there was a lot more rain or the vegetation was just slightly different. So there's less compaction that might be happening on that land. But overall, we did see that significant increase in compaction. And then I think that one of the most interesting facts that came from this was actually in the survey section. So when we were doing the survey, we had that land use section and that installation practices, as well as the farmer experience. And one of the main questions that I thought was super interesting was, during the installation process, were there times when soil conditions were not optimal, but pipeline installation continued? And we specified what optimal or suboptimal meant. And we gave them slightly suboptimal was that soils were still wet, but I would only drive on them if tasks were essential and very important and time sensitive. And then extremely suboptimal in that question was soils were completely saturated and worked during or immediately after large rain events, and I would not have been on them personally. And we actually had 78% of respondents say that soils were suboptimal, and 55.5% of those people said that they were completely saturated. So that was really significant. Obviously, during the installation time, we looked back at weather patterns and rainfall during the installation times for these pipelines, and it was a really wet year. But that also means that the pipelines were still being installed when the soils were extremely wet as well. And towards the end of the survey for that landowner experience, we asked a question asking if the lands were generally back to the condition that it was prior to the pipeline installation. And 82% of people said that they were not back to that pre-installation situation. And over half, so 56% or so, said that they were not satisfied with having a pipeline installed on their ground. And a quarter of people said, only a quarter, said that they would be open to have another pipeline go through their ground as well. So we thought that was really significant because that showed that across all of the pipelines across the entire state that were being installed during that time, most people were generally unhappy and they were not open to having this experience happen again, which is pretty significant.
Hi, everyone. I hope you're enjoying the show. Interested in learning more? Theresa's paper, Soil Degradation and Crop Yield Declines Persist 5 Years After Pipeline Installations, published in Soil Science Society of America Journal, is always freely available. If you are a certified crop advisor or a certified professional soil scientist, you can take a quiz for continuing education units for this episode, which can be found in our show notes or on certifiedcropadvisor.org. Thank you for being our sponsor. Let's get back to the show. I have a few questions off of that. So just to get a little bit more detail, so this obviously was being done after that 5-year period, but was it like starting in year 6 then, or like the end of year 5, or?
Good question. So going back to like at the very beginning when I was talking about compensation, so normally during year 4 or 5 is when compensation stops for farmers. So that's when we were starting the study. So we started because the pipeline gets installed it was about a year and a half across the pipelines. So we were starting on year 4 for some of our soils and year 5 for some of the other ones, just because we were taking samples across the whole entire top of the state at the same exact time.
Okay. And then you mentioned the yields for corn and soybean, like the differences between those. Are those in like a corn soybean rotation where it would have just been like every other? So you got corn one year and soybean the next on all sites, or vice versa?
Yep, that's exactly correct. So in year 1, if they were corn, they'd be soybeans in year 2 and vice versa.
Okay. That's what I assumed. I just wanted to clarify. You mentioned having clay being kind of brought up and that being evidence of mixing with the subsoil and the topsoil. So obviously that would change like what you're looking for as far as if you were on like a different soil type, right? Like, is that true? Is there any interesting things to explore conversationally there?
Something that I guess that's really important when I'm talking about all of this is that we were measuring each site against itself, not necessarily each site against all of the other sites. So we were measuring particle size distribution from the right-of-way on one field to the adjacent area on that same field. So the soil types, we made sure were the exact same, like spatially across the field before we took the soil samples. So when I'm saying that the clay was higher, it was higher in this field compared to 200 feet away in the exact same field and the same soil type.
Okay, cool. Because I, as people may not be surprised to know, do not know a lot about soil science or soil types. So I was like, well, what if you just had a really clay-ish idea? What matters about so it's interesting to just note that you were thinking about that and kind of working around that in your calculations, which kind of bleeds into the other question that I was going to ask, which is, did you find anything regarding the single versus double lift excavation techniques?
Yeah, great question. So all 3 of our pipelines were installed with double lift excavation. And so when I was looking at single lift versus double lift, that was really looking at like a literature review of historically, this is what single lift has done, and this is what double lift is doing currently. So I would say that our study kind of is consistent. It's showing that pipeline installation does have degrading effects on soils over time and crop yields as well. I think without a longer term study, it's going to be really difficult to actually analyze that. So some of our studies that were single lift, they were looking at those soils over 30 years. And so obviously this study was only done over 2 years. So I would really love to see a longer term study that can kind of document those things over time. And I also just want to mention that obviously we've been talking in generals and like averages across all of our studies, but it's really important, especially in the context of pipeline installation. Every single site is individual and is really site specific. So when we were talking before about weather variability and how it might be super wet or it might be super dry when this pipeline's being installed, all of that impacts how the soils and the crops interact after the pipeline's been installed. So some of our soils that we were looking at after the pipeline was installed, there were essentially no significant differences between the right-of-way and adjacent areas. Other ones had extremely significant differences. So it's going to be really important to take this all with a little grain of salt and really dig into the details rather than just making some of these generalizations and saying, well, all pipelines are bad, but they're really not. It's really about the installation practices and the remediation that's happening after the fact, making sure these can get back to 100% productivity.
Yeah, for sure. And that's part of why I like that you were taking like so many measurements and asking so many people in your survey. I mean, obviously there was 25% that were like Yeah, I would do that again. So, there's, as you mentioned earlier, there's going to be a broad range between people that were excited and not at all excited. So yeah, nobody wants the farm to suffer in the end. We all want it to get back to being healthy. I think that leads kind of into our next couple of questions here. Obviously, there are a lot of key takeaways and implications, especially for farmers, but also for companies and organizations looking to install these pipelines. But also, as you mentioned, a lot of future research to continue researching the impacts here and how to move forward. So I would be curious what you think kind of the key takeaways or action items or future research to kind of improve this process for everybody involved would be.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the most important thing that can come out of this research is just that farmers have more information. So a lot of the farmers that I was talking to said, well, Theresa, when we first started this process, we were looking for anything that could give us any information about what we might expect from this pipeline installation process, like what the remediation timeline might look like, what compensation should be, and they couldn't find anything. So I'm hoping that, especially by publishing all of this data in open access, so it's available for anyone to read, that the information will just get out there and farmers can kind of create a better workaround for themselves to be able to have a good platform when they're starting these conversations as pipelines are starting to be installed. But then also just give them more autonomy if they see that there's remediation that hasn't been completed to the extent that it should be on their land. They can kind of take this information back to the pipeline companies or to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and say, hey, we've got data that proves that this is happening. Can you come out to my field and I can show you where it's happening on my field? And just kind of have that baseline for being able to do improvements and bring it back to the quality of soil that it should be and the quality of crop production that it also should be. I think that additionally, it can also give farmers a little bit more leverage when they're doing some of these contract negotiations. So I know that some of our farmers that we were working with had kind of created like a cooperative of farmers. So there's like 15 of them that had gotten together and they did their contract negotiations together. And maybe some of this research will just be able to kind of promote that and make sure that people are talking back and forth, because when pipelines are installed, it can be kind of secretive between landowners. Like you're not necessarily allowed to have conversations about, well, this is what I'm getting compensated for. How much are you getting compensated for? Or just sort of some things like that. So hopefully it can give people just a little baseline to be able to talk about these things, and it'll give them an opportunity to be more successful going forward.
Sure. Do you feel that secretiveness is that like a contractual, like non-disclosure thing, or is that just like a not culturally cool to talk about money kind of deal?
I think it's a little bit of both, actually. So on some of the pipelines, especially if they're privately owned and being installed off of private money, those have a little bit more tendency, anecdotally from what I've been told, they have a bit more tendency to be a bit more secretive, just because, again, Farmer Joe can be paid a little bit more if they know how to speak about how much their land is worth compared to Farmer Tina, who might not, or vice versa. The federal energy, like all of the FERC regulated ones, are, from what I've been told, a little bit less secretive, but they also have really complicated contracts on both sides. So farmers who might not be used to reading 200-page legal documents might get really confused. I got really confused reading through some of the environmental impact statements and the agricultural mitigation statements as well. And it was my entire job to be able to read through that at the same time. So when you're worried about crop harvest and moisture sensors and like tractors going into it, like needing to be fixed and things like that, you're not necessarily going to be super focused on being able to read through all of the nitty-gritty details. So hopefully some of this will be able to just refresh that information and make it a little bit easier to digest.
Sure. Yeah. Man, once again, just highlighting that farmers are doing the most.
Absolutely. All the time. There's so many things that they're working on all the time.
For sure. And thank you for doing the most in doing this research and helping them out and helping both parties to just, negotiate the best way forward, because obviously anything to do with any of these topics is extremely complicated and nuanced. And, nobody wants the land to not do well, at the end of the day.
Yeah, absolutely. So like our energy requests are not going to go down, but our food requests aren't either. So as we keep increasing our population and we have more urbanization, there needs to be more concentration of good food being produced in a local area. So I think it's just really important to be able to have the most and best quality production on the land that we have.
Absolutely. So I have 3 questions left for you. The first one is, if listeners want to learn more about any of the things that we've talked about today, where can they go for more information?
Yeah, absolutely. So like I mentioned before, all of our research that we've published about this is open access. So you can literally just type in pipeline study, Ohio State, or anything like that, and it should pull up some of this information. We have a review article that I developed that was looking at essentially everything that's been published that I could find across the whole world. So there's studies from China and the United States and Canada and Brazil, all included in the same literature review. So you can read through that just to get a little bit of a baseline about how different aspects of soil are impacted. But then it also goes into natural versus agricultural landscapes. And there's some like shrub and steppe grass in there as well. So that's super interesting. You can also look at the summary of our landowner experiences in that survey as well if you just type in Pipeline Study Ohio State. So you should be able to find everything like that.
Awesome. For sure. We will include links to those resources as much as we are able to in the show notes. So then the second question is, if people want to take the next step and get involved, or if there's advice for farmers that you would give, what would you tell them?
Yeah, I'll speak first to farmers and then I'll speak second to everyone else listening. So first, if you've got a pipeline coming in, do as much research as you're able and reach out to me. Feel free to do that. I can give you contacts to people who you can talk to, other farmers who have had the pipelines go through, so you can kind of talk about their experiences. Also, reach out to your local Department of Ag or your Farm Bureau. That's how I was able to get in contact with a lot of the farmers that I was working with, and just kind of do all of the baseline research that you can before you sign a contract and know who to contact to work on the remediation aspect. I know a lot of our farmers that we worked with, halfway through the remediation, the person that they were calling switched jobs, and then all of a sudden they didn't know who to talk to anymore. So make sure that you've got a working phone number for that person all the time. For all the rest of the people listening, if you don't have a pipeline going through your land, you can always write a letter to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, kind of just keep up to date on what pipelines are going to be installed in your area, and just support all of the farmers and landowners who are going through this. Like if they need anything, it's a really stressful process. And to have an entire field or half of the field taken out of working production for 5+ years is really stressful. So do anything that you can to just support the people that it's happening to.
Yeah, for sure. So final question then is, what is one fun fact that listeners would not know about you if all they had was your research?
I'm a super outdoorsy person, and my husband and I just got married last year. Yay!
Yeah.
But we ended up backpacking up to about 12,000 feet elevation to an alpine lake, and we got married up there with just a couple of our friends and family. So it was a really amazing trip. We got hailed on, snowed on, rained on. And then the day of the wedding was beautiful and sunny and like 75 degrees.
Oh, perfect. Congratulations. Did your guests have to like do any elevation training in order? I do not hike, but I just know the higher you go, the more you have to be ready.
Oh yeah, for sure. So most of us were coming from like sea level or like just above sea level. So definitely a lot of elevation training and just like practicing the hikes, but we took it pretty slow on the way up just because like my sister got elevation sickness, which was really hard. So we ended up taking a break for a little bit, and then your body kind of gets adjusted as you go up higher, and then just take breaks as you go.
Oh, that's such an intensive wedding. I love that.
It was crazy. Would not do it again, but it was a really cool experience.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you only got to do it once. So that's great.
Exactly.
Awesome. Well, this has been such a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for your time and the research you're doing to help our buddies, the farmers. So we love them dearly. So thanks for all you're doing.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you so much for having me. This has been a lot of fun.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to our Student Spotlight, where we highlight the work of graduate and undergraduate society student members. Today, we'll be talking to Amanda. Welcome to the show. Can you start us off by introducing yourself and where you're studying?
Hi, Abby. Thank you for the opportunity to share my work on the podcast. I'm Amanda Ferreira, a member of Soil Science Society of America, and I just finished my PhD in soil science at the University of São Paulo in Brazil. part of the research was developed in a partnership with North Carolina State University.
Awesome. And what are you currently researching?
So, on my PhD, I studied how to apply the knowledge of soil biogeochemistry to improve soil and water remediation using native wetland plants. In this research, we used different amendments to increase iron solubility and also improve the biomass production of a native wetland plant in Brazil. The objective was to increase the iron absorption to remediate those soils affected by mining tailings, and now we are developing a protocol to convert the plant biomass in an iron ore. It's called iron bio-ore.
Great. And if you could have your dream research project, what would that look like?
So I believe that we have a lot to learn from nature, and nature-based solutions are the most effective way to face big challenges as climate changes. So for my dream project, I would apply what we know about how wetland soils work, the process occurring there, and how to manipulate them to improve ecosystem service provided by wetland environments. For instance, controlling carbon and fossil cycles.
Awesome. Well, if you'd like to get in touch with Amanda about her work, we'll have her contact information in our show notes. Thank you so much for being on the show today, and best wishes on your future studies and career. Thank you.
Thank you, Abby.
Thank you for listening to Field Lab Earth. More information can be found in the description below. Thank you.